The Department of Homeland Security recently launched an investigation that triggered a massive, sweeping review of our municipal voter files. And what they found? It's staggering. In their initial audits across states like California, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Nevada, investigators flagged over 250,000 anomalies sitting right there in the public voter registries. Specifically, we are talking about individuals allegedly registered as non-citizens. Now, this isn't just happening in a vacuum. The Department of Justice and the Department of Homeland Security are stepping in, using enforcement powers granted by two foundational laws. We're looking at the National Voter Registration Act of 1993 and the Help America Vote Act of 2002. Together, these legal frameworks give federal agencies the exact statutory authority they need to look directly under the hood of state databases and, crucially, force the removal of anyone who is legally ineligible to vote. At the absolute core of this review is a highly advanced administrative mechanism known as the SAVE system. That stands for Systematic Alien Verification for Entitlements. By the summer of 2026, 25 different states had proactively run a combined 68 million individual voter registration records right through this database. So what did this cross-referencing protocol actually expose? Well, the system flagged over 400,000 deceased individuals still actively listed on the rolls. More critically, it identified 28,000 non-citizens registered to vote in domestic elections. When we isolate this data and look at specific jurisdictions using the SAVE system, the metrics are undeniable. Take a look at Texas, for example. Over 111,000 deceased individuals flagged. Georgia showed a similarly massive vulnerability with over 42,000. Look at the numbers across these 10 specific states: Ohio, Tennessee, North Carolina, Idaho, Alabama, Missouri, Louisiana, Kansas. The data reveals a persistent structural flaw in how these local databases are being maintained. It really fuels the argument for continuous federal oversight, doesn't it?
But as you might expect, this federal push hit a massive legal roadblock. Officials at United States Citizenship and Immigration Services, or USCIS, attempted to expand the SAVE system through specific memoranda of agreement with the states. But then Judge Sparkle Suknan issued a judicial injunction. This single ruling abruptly suspended those enhanced cross-referencing capabilities. It basically froze the states' proactive audits in their tracks. Right while the complex boundaries of federal overreach and jurisdictional authority are being fiercely debated in court.
But internal bureaucratic bottlenecks? That's really only half the story here. When you look at the declassified intelligence, it outlines a relentless chronological timeline of cyber attacks targeting these systems from the outside. We're talking about local county breaches back in 2016, massive exposures of millions of records in 2017, all the way up to compromised software vendors in 2023. The entire architecture of American voting is facing systemic, unclassified infiltrations from both foreign and domestic exploiters. Let's break down a very precise, tactical example. Riverside County, California, July 2016. A malicious actor targeted their systems. Using stolen, personally identifiable information, things like names, birth dates, social security numbers, this hacker managed to log straight into the state's online portal. And without the actual voters ever knowing, this actor executed systemic, mass alterations to the political party affiliations of those registered voters. Total unauthorized manipulation. And you have to understand, this threat scales rapidly across multiple jurisdictions. Joint findings from the FBI and DHS mapped out how, in 2016, Russian actors stole roughly 500,000 records from the Illinois State Board of Elections. At the same time, they were probing systems across all 50 states, eventually breaching Arizona. Then, just months later, in March 2017, a colossal security failure at Kennesaw State University exposed the records of nearly 7 million Georgia voters. They were left completely vulnerable for over half a year. Now, this fragility isn't just sitting in government offices. It extends deep into the private vendors they contract. In 2023, New Hampshire election officials discovered a massive operational failure in their software supply chain. A vendor that was hired to upgrade the state's aging voter database had secretly offshored the coding work. The result? Absolutely terrifying. The new software architecture was actively trying to connect to servers in Russia, and they even found foreign code injected directly into the system architecture. So, how exactly are adversaries exploiting these vulnerabilities? It comes down to a very strict administrative escalation model. Step 1, obtain the personally identifiable information. Step 2, weaponize that exposed data to impersonate valid registrants, bypassing authentication checkpoints to log in. Once inside, they execute Step 3, altering polling locations, or conducting distributed deletions of registrants. Ultimately, they use those stolen credentials to request and intercept absentee ballots at scale. And here is what makes this threat architecture so uniquely dangerous. It doesn't expire. Think about it. If your credit card is stolen, you just cancel it, right? But your birth date, your social security number, those never change. This is the threat of dormant data exploitation. Data stolen from a municipal database back in 2021 remains fully viable. It's just sitting there waiting to be used to bypass identity verification protocols for an election in 2028. Broadening the scope here, this structural vulnerability is made exponentially worse by massive breaches in the private sector. Over the last decade, macro-level corporate data breaches across healthcare providers, banks, and background check firms have spilled critical American demographic data onto the global dark web. In doing so, these private entities are inadvertently supplying the dark marketplace with the exact actionable intelligence needed to compromise absentee ballot verification. We aren't just talking about isolated random hackers either. This is frequently state-sponsored warfare. Take February 2020, for example. Attorney General William Barr and the Department of Justice unsealed a major indictment against 4 members of the Chinese People's Liberation Army. The charge? A systematic campaign of economic and computer fraud targeting massive civilian databases. They successfully extracted the personal information of over 140 million American citizens. That is a staggering reservoir of data that can be weaponized against election systems. The sheer scale of these corporate leaks poses a direct structural threat to our public sector verification. Just look at the numbers. In April 2024, a single background check firm exposed nearly 3 billion records. By June 2025, a supplemental insurance provider leaked data on another 22.65 million individuals. That exact demographic data, the social security numbers, the dates of birth, those are the identical administrative keys required to access and ultimately alter municipal voter registries. Faced with these intense, overlapping threats, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA, has mandated a rigorous set of defensive protocols. The foundational mechanisms are straightforward, but absolutely crucial. Jurisdictions must maintain frequent, securely stored offline database backups, and they must constantly test their restoration capabilities. And if the digital infrastructure experiences a complete failure during an incident, municipalities are required to maintain resilient plans, which means producing physical, paper pollbook backups ready to deploy instantly. Securing the network authentication architecture itself is the next mandatory layer. CISA's credentialing requirements are strict. They demand the enforcement of multi-factor authentication, meaning a password alone is never going to be enough. They enforce the principle of least privilege, which restricts staff to only having administrative control over the specific data they absolutely need. And to neutralize complex phishing vectors, systems must implement advanced authentication protocols like DMARC for all email communications. Terminating our analysis, the final CISA architectural mandates require advanced infrastructural defense. Networks have to integrate DDoS mitigation to absorb massive targeted web traffic attacks. They require complete network segmentation, so internal systems are entirely walled off from one another. Critical vulnerabilities must be patched within a strict 15-day window. Finally, they require the implementation of endpoint detection and response, and utilizing malicious domain blocking and reporting to intercept ransomware payloads before they ever hit state servers. The mechanisms of our registry architecture are digital, and the strict adherence to these defenses is the only thing standing between operational integrity and systemic compromise.